All right, so the process that we're doing today is the Japanese side stitch, also known as the Japanese stab stitch. Let's talk about the binding stitch itself. So this is an example of the Japanese side stitch or stab stitch. It's a really nice, just like simple-ish looking binding. It can be elaborated on in different ways. We're going to be doing 2 punches for our stitch today, but you can do multiple punches. It's really easy, or it's somewhat easy to build on this stitch. But this is the process that we're going to be using today, making a little book that has those lovely stitches in the end. So this is just an example of how it'll turn out today. Let's talk a little bit about supplies. So what we need today from our kit is going to be the awl, which is the small looking ice pick thing. If you don't have the awl with you, you can use anything that has a sharp point, like a needle or a thumbtack or a safety pin, or even an ice pick. But the awl is nice because it has that grip on the end that's a little easier for our hands. So if you have that awl, go ahead and pull that one out. The next thing we need out of our kit is going to be our embroidery floss. But be careful if you get your kit for the first time, the tapestry needle is inside that, kind of keeping that point safe. So we'll need that embroidery floss. If you don't have embroidery floss or you want to use something else, you're definitely welcome to. Any kind of yarn, other embroidery floss colors, string, ribbon. There's a lot of really great thread-like supplies that work well for the binding stitch we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be using some green embroidery floss and then that tapestry needle. The tapestry needle is not absolutely necessary. It's helpful when going through the holes. It just makes it a little easier. And it has a really large eye on it. So it works well with embroidery floss or like thread, ribbon, things like that. So we'll be using that tapestry needle today. What also will be helpful is having covers and inside paper. So for my inside pages today, I'm going to be using some construction paper that I cut up, but any kind of paper will work for this. If you want to use like copy paper, sketchbook paper, printing paper, even found paper works well. Really any kind of paper will work for the inside of our book today. And then for the outside of our book, I'm going to be using some watercolor paper, but I had a little watercolor that I made last year in one of our botanical art making classes, actually. And so I'm going to be using it today. I'm going to make a little nature journal for myself. So I'm using watercolor paper, which is nice and thick. So good paper or good supplies to use for a cover are going to be something that's a little sturdy. So something like watercolor paper, mixed media paper, cardstock, even like cereal boxes. That cardboard is a really good supply to use for a cover, or like I think in this series I've used a mac and cheese box before. So anything that's like a thin cardboard will work well. I've also used the back of a notepad as a cover. That's really good. You can use some thicker material, thicker cardboard, but the thing to remember is that we're going to be poking holes through it. So you don't want something that's too sturdy to poke through, if that makes sense. So the size of paper that I'm using today, my card here is a 4x6, or sorry, 5x7. The card I'm using today is 5x7. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter the size of that you use. All that matters is that your inside paper is the same size or a little smaller than your cover paper, or your cover. And so mine is a 5x7. And so my cover, or my inside paper, you can see fits right inside my cover paper. I have just a little bit of that trim sticking out on all sides. It doesn't have to be slightly smaller, but it helps a little bit if it is slightly smaller. It's okay if it's the same size as well. The thing to think about when we're making like the inside paper, making these covers, is that you want something that you'll be able to poke through. And so you don't want a huge number of paper. I think the papers that I have here, let me actually count. I have 12 papers here. So it's not like, that's probably on the higher end. It'll take me a while to kind of poke through those. But that's about a good number to start with for sure. If you want to do more pages than that, you can, like I can split this and poke holes through this stack and then poke holes through this stack. It's a little longer process to do, and you want to make sure that the holes line up. So it's kind of an extra step in there, but that's one way to get more paper inside your book. Now, if you have your handout, we're going to kind of follow along with that today. So that first step is to cut the paper and the covers to roughly the same size. You want to make the inside papers, you want to sandwich them in between the covers. And so what I have today, I have my construction paper here, my sheets of construction paper that I'm going to use for my inside. And for my outsides, I have the pieces of watercolor paper. And so what I'm going to do, if you already have your papers cut, go ahead and line them up. If you're still cutting your paper, definitely take time to do that for sure. But what I'm going to do to line my papers up, you can see right now I have that white edge, that little frame all the way around. I'm going to be binding my book on the left side today. And so what I'm going to do is take my inside paper and line it up with that left side, right? So I have that frame on the top, the side, and the bottom, right? So I'm going to be doing the binding part on the left side today. So just like my example, I have the binding on the left side. And so you can see in my example here, that paper is all the way up against that side. Okay? And so that's what we're doing here. So my cover paper and my inside paper are butted up right against each other on the left side. And so I'm going to take that cover paper, the top cover, and line it up too. So you can see we've got, again, that little white frame on all sides. Now, the truth is you don't have to have that buffer edge, but I like having it because sometimes I'm not as straight or exact as I'd like to be. And so it gives me kind of this little buffer so my inside papers don't stick out. But you're probably more careful than I am. But what I'm going to do is just make sure that one side is lined up because that's where I'm doing my binding today. I know we've talked before about the importance of holding everything in place because we want those holes to line up. And so one way to kind of make sure everything stays in place and make sure those papers line up on the end is to take something like a paper clip or a binder clip and just kind of hold them in place. This is really helpful for me that I found to kind of keep everything lined up. Again, you don't have to do that. Rubber bands work as well. If you're careful, I try to be careful, but sometimes that's not always the case. So these binder clips help a lot. So it just kind of helps keep everything lined up for us. So after we line everything up, we move on to our next step. And that next step is to poke those 2 holes in all the way through our book. Right? Now, as I said earlier, you can poke several different holes, like a lot of holes in here. You could do 4, you can do many more than that. But today, since we're just starting this process, we're going to do just 2. We're going to start simple today. And so what I'm going to do is kind of decide where I want those holes. I want them kind of centered here. So I'm just going to, I'm going to use a marker so it's a little easier to see on camera. But I'm just going to poke 2 holes. So in my marker here, you can see I have the 2 holes lined up. They're not all the way to the edge, right? They're kind of in some. You don't have to have it this close to the edge. You can go further in if you want. But I'm going about, I think this is about a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch in. So it's not like a huge amount in. Again, you can go deeper if you want, but for today, I'm just doing that little gap in, maybe a fingernail length. Okay. And so I'm starting with those 2 holes. So after you mark your space, you know where those holes are going to go. We're going to take our awl and go through those holes. Now be careful because the awl is sharp. And if you're using any other sharp like supply, of course, watch your fingers. I have a cutting mat underneath mine, but if you don't have a cutting mat, using like a thick piece of cardboard is also good to have under, protect your work surface. So I'm just going to take my awl and poke through. It may take a minute, especially if you're using thick paper or several layers. And so what I'm doing is I'm just very carefully kind of applying pressure and twisting that awl and just going through. I'm not super forcing, adding just a little pressure and careful not to poke my hands, my fingers, but I'm pushing it through. And once I get my awl all the way through, I'm just going to kind of wiggle it a little bit and open that space up. Again, this is where it's helpful to have like paper clips or rubber band or binder clip to hold it together so you can keep those holes lined up. But you can see that hole goes all the way through. Okay. So once you get that first one in there, we'll go over to the other side, that other mark that I have here. I'm going to poke that other hole in. And again, we just want to be careful adding that hole, and I'm just kind of applying a little pressure and twisting my awl. And so if you're using like an ice pick or anything like that, you'll kind of do that same thing. Poke it all the way through and do a little twisting to kind of guide it in. The benefit of using the awl is that it does gradually get, like it gets slightly larger the deeper you go. So it helps open that hole up a little bit. So I usually go about halfway with my awl, a little wiggle. And so we have those two holes. Now the binding part is a little tricky. You know, in the last couple of weeks, we've done like the punch stitch, which was a pretty basic stitch. And then last week we did a saddle stitch, which was another basic stitch. This one is a little more technical, though it's not as technical as the Coptic binding, which took us 2 weeks, 2 weeks to do. But this one, it's laid out pretty like color coded with the steps that we're going to do. And I'm going to walk us through it. We're going to follow through this process here. And so I'm going to lay my book in the same direction as my image here. So go ahead and pull out your tapestry needle and embroidery floss. And I'm just going to pull out, it's always better to pull out too much than not enough. And so I'm just going to pull out an arm length of embroidery floss. That'll give me a little extra room to kind of play. And I'm going to cut it up. So an arm length is about a yard-ish, 3 feet. And so this is a good kind of starting place for us when it comes to the binding. So I'm using green embroidery floss today, and hopefully that's pretty easy to see on camera. But once you have your embroidery floss cut, go ahead and thread that tapestry needle. All right. Now that first step is going to be that top hole, right? We're going to come up from the bottom and come through that first hole. So we have hole 1 and hole 2 here. So our first step is that green step on our handout. So if you're following along, take your tapestry needle and we're going to come up through the bottom of our book to the top, right? You won't need to knot it or anything. We're going to tie it off at the end. We're going to leave a tail hanging though. So I'm going up from the bottom in that first hole and pulling it through. I'm leaving a tail though. And my tail is about a finger length, just a few inches. It doesn't have to be super long. We're going to tie it off in the end. I don't know, like bringing my example back, I have a little knot a little bow that I tied off. And that's what I've done with my tails. It doesn't have to be a little bow. It can be a knot or beaded or whatever. But that's what we're going to do to kind of tie it off at the end. And so go through that top hole, going from the bottom of your book to the top, leaving that little bit of a tail. I'm going to come down just a little bit. So our next step after we do that is that pink step. It's pulling that floss around the top. We're doing number 2. So we just did number 1, coming from the bottom, going to the top. And so I'm going to go around the top of my book and come back through that same hole. So I'm going that same direction I did before, coming from the bottom to the top in that same hole and pulling through. And so what happens is we have this little loop here that goes around the top. We're making that loop. So what we've done is come through that same hole twice, going that same direction. I started from the bottom and came up through the hole. I wrapped it around and came up through the bottom to the top again. And we're going to go through that hole one more time, right? So this time I'm going to wrap it around the left side and again go through that same hole. Yeah, so we're doing our binding on the left side of our book to match our drawing here, our illustrated instruction. And so we've gone through this first hole now 3 times, that same direction, going from the bottom to the top. And I'll pull it out and show it one more time. I know it feels kind of tricky, but we're literally going through the same hole. So that first step, this is the top of my book. I'm binding on my left side. I'm matching my image here. And so I'm taking that tapestry needle. My first stitch is coming up from the bottom to the top, right? And I'm leaving that little tail. So I'm going to wrap it around, wrap that cording around on top and go through that same hole again, bottom to top. So I've done it twice. I've gone through that same hole twice now. And we're pulling it just slightly tight because we want to keep our pages together. But because we have a tail here, we can't get it super tight. We'll kind of adjust it a little bit in the end. So that was our first step and our second step. I went through the bottom, came up to the top twice. So our third step is that blue step on our paper. And so that's going around the book again. We're going to the bottom and we're going to go through that same hole a third time, going from the bottom to the top. So what we have now, you see the binding, our binding here. I have a binding looping around the top and a looping around the side of the book. So we've gone through that same hole 3 times, going from the bottom to the top, wrapping it around, going from the bottom to the top, wrapping it around, right? 3 times. So now what we're going to do, our next step, we're going to move down to that bottom hole, okay? And we're going to kind of repeat everything we just did, right? So I'm going to take my embroidery floss and thread it, but I'm going to go from the top down, right? Because my embroidery floss is on the top now. I'm going to go from the top down through the bottom. Right. So you can see that binding is starting to appear in the top, right? The left side, sorry. That binding is starting to appear. And we're just kind of continuing that pattern on. Again, I'm just like, if we bring that example in, we can see that we're building, it's wrapping around our book. We're doing that same thing here. Okay. So for my fourth step, I was at the top of my book here. And so I went to my second hole and I went from the top down, right? So I'm going to wrap it around again. That fifth step we're going to do is that orange step here. We're going to wrap it around again. We're going to go through that same hole, and we're going to go from the top to the bottom, repeating that, right? So from the top to the bottom. And then doing it again, wrapping it around. We're on the bottom. We're going to go from the top to the bottom and the hole again. Okay. So what happened is we're going through each of those holes 3 times. On that first hole, we're going from the bottom to the top 3 times. And in this second hole, we're going from the top to the bottom. So we're kind of doing the opposite. But you can see as I'm pulling it through, I'm making this little binding on the end. So after we get to this point, we can flip our book over, and you can see we have those 2 tails. So this is where you can knot it off. You can make a bow with it. You can knot it and add some beads if you want to do any kind of embellishment. This is the place to do that. So I'm going to move my illustrated instructions here. So one of the things I want to do before I tie it off is I want to just make sure all my strings are tight, right? And so I'm just going to kind of give a little tug on my tails and just make sure those embroidery floss pieces are a little tight. And I'll go to that other tail and pull it a little bit too. So we're just kind of tightening those edges. So after we do that side, I'm going to flip it over. So after you kind of give your tails a little tug, which feels funny to say that way, the tail of the embroidery floss, a little tug, just kind of tightening those pages together, we'll tie it off. And so usually it's good, even before you do any embellishments, it's good to kind of do a little knot just to make sure everything is like snug and in place. So I'm going to do a couple knots here just to make sure everything is in place. And so I can leave this long and add like beads to it. I can add a tassel to it. Like there are lots of, turn it into a bow. There are lots of options, I guess, for this. And I think I am going to do a bow, but I'm going to leave it with the back here. I'll just kind of finish that off. And then trim those edges. So if you already made yours, you'll notice the cover doesn't open completely, doesn't stay open. So this is where something like that bone folder comes in handy. Or if you have a ruler or just a straight edge. So I'm going to take my bone folder to help kind of with my cover here, and I'm going to line it up with my holes here and just kind of hold it in place. And then with my cover, just kind of fold it right along there. So what's happening is I'm making that folded edge. So now it stays open when I write or whatever, do whatever with it. But because we have that binding that goes all the way across, that fold is hidden, so you don't see that crease in it. But that's a way to do like that bone folder or a ruler, anything that's sharp, just kind of lining it up with that binding and then bending that paper up. And you can do that even with cardboard. So as you're going through, once you do that first one, let's say I put all my pressed flowers on this one, I'm ready to turn the page, I can just turn it and crease it as I go through it. And it'll still lay flat when you're done, but you just kind of crease each page as you're going through. Yeah. And you can see like with this one here that I did some thicker paper on the inside. And so as I'm going through, I'll still do that same thing, just kind of crease it. And because it's right on that seam where the binding is, you won't see those creases much.